This lecture turns to the legends of Aeneas and the founders of Rome. After the fall of Troy in the Trojan War begins the story for the Romans. Now, interestingly enough, Roman foundation stories and myth are linked to the tradition of Venus and Aeneas, as we discussed. Obviously, Venus being Aeneas's mother. Now, there is no native tradition for myth in Rome. There's no creation story as to how the world came to be. There is no divine myth on specific gods that exist controlling this universe like the Greeks had. Instead, Roman myth can be understood as legend. Thus, of course, Roman history is understood as legend in the same way. So they look back on their history, they create, they make up their own story to explain the rise of Rome and the grand tradition that follows. Thus, legend becomes propaganda in Rome. The best example of this is Virgil's Aeneid, written for the first emperor of Rome, Augustus, in which we find the first half is based on the travels of the hero Aeneas, based on the Odyssey, where Odysseus is having these travels. The second half of Virgil's Aeneid chronicles the wars, just like we see with the Iliad. So self-consciously, and this is, remember, hundreds of years after the founding of Rome when this official foundation myth is born in this epic poem of the Aeneid, they're basically co-opting what the Greeks did in their greatest comedy and tragedy, that being the Odyssey and the Iliad. Now, the Roman periods begin in 753 with the monarchy and move on to the Republican period in 509 until we reach the Empire, founded in 27 BCE. Rome will not fall until 337. Actually, it is sacked in 410 Common Era by the Visigoths. Rome would become the largest civilization, controlling the greatest geopolitical entity the world has ever seen up to this stage, far outstripping the Persians, far outstripping Alexander the Great. They control all of Western Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, all the way up to England. So they make, as they love to call it, the Mediterranean a Roman lake. The Rome that we're familiar with and that many democracies in the Western world are founded on is Republican Rome. We find first Rome is founded in 750 BCE, first by Romulus, the first king who gives Rome its name. We'll discuss him. In 509, after the monarchy is overthrown with the Tarquins, the last Etruscan king being Tarquinius Superbus, we have a constitutional government established, which should sound familiar to us. It is ruled by a senate or senectute, or a senior citizens council of elders, that being old men rule, and two elected co-consuls, that being you have a senate that supposedly democratically represents the various constituencies in Rome, but two people, much like two presidents, can veto one another. So there's never a tyrant. One side is never going to be more powerful than the other. So in times of crisis, however, we can elect a dictator or someone who is in charge of the armies to command them if there is ever a foreign invader coming. Later on, we find patricians are going to give way to the plebeian class, that being the lower classes that are able to rule. Now, patrician families, or wealthy aristocratic families as we would understand them, fabricated legendary traditions to justify their monopoly on power and their great wealth. They must have been descended from great deities or demigods like Hercules or Venus, as the first Roman emperor claimed to be descended directly from Venus through Aeneas. Now, the native Roman religion, that developed before it began interacting with other cultures, is interesting. For they did have gods, sort of. They had native deities called numen for male things and numena for female. They were the personification of various qualities, and these spirits would inhabit any object in nature or that is man-made. So we find that there is a numen for bridges, a numena for plates, a cupboard, right? So there are these spirits that control various objects. Now, sacrificium, as we know it, is going to be the ceremony whereby you're asking the numen or the spirit to do something for you. So you're sacrificing so that it will give you, once again, protection on your travels, reward you in business, right? Ensure that you are, once again, otherwise using the power of the natural world to your benefit. Roman priests, in fact, acted like lawyers, fulfilling these contracts with numen, in which we find someone who is giving a sacrifice to this particular spirit is contractually obliged to put forth money and or an animal to be sacrificed, and thus we would know if the numen is going to help them through divination. So divination can take many forms in different religions, but usually involves reading the stars, animal entrails, or how stones fall. Now, the functions of these particular numen are kind of interesting. That being, they are divided and subdivided into sub-deities. So Ceres, the goddess we discussed, will be subdivided into the first plower, second plower, third plower, and so on. So we find that you might have a god that's in charge of something once they're introduced to the Greeks, but that task is subdivided into various elements that they might be in charge of throughout nature. However, most of these numen or numina are going to be remote and colorless. They don't have bodies. They do not look like us, nor do they look like things in nature. They are just spirits that inhabit inanimate objects. The best known numen that we can tell today comes into our language is Janus, or otherwise gate. This is the numen of bridges, hence the god of coming and going, in which we see the representation later on as a man with two faces looking forward and back. This god gives his name to January, the month that looks forward and back on the previous year and towards the new year. So Janus is still going to be very important for the Romans and for our own calendar. Now, the Forum also has a gate without buildings that would remain closed at peacetime and open at war. This is going to be near the Temple of Janus, and thus, of course, this god is essentially linked to times of war. As seen here in Peter Paul Rubens' painting, the Temple of Janus in the background has its door open. Thus, we can see war occurring in the foreground. Now, Roman deities are going to be highly influenced by Greek deities once they take over ancient Greece and her colonies. Roman poets are thus under the influence of these anthropomorphic Greek gods, and with their poetic inventions that are non-native to ancient Roman religion. So they are put in contact with and influenced by these peoples they begin overcoming and overtaking, and they are going to take and adopt many aspects of their religion. So Rome, the three most important gods and goddesses that we discussed early on, is their Capitoline triad that includes Jupiter and Juno, the king and queen of the gods, and Minerva, the goddess of war, all very appropriate for the Romans, who prize themselves on being great warriors and conquerors. First, Zeus is going to turn into Jupiter or Jove. This is going to align with the numen the Romans have of the bright sky. Etymologically, this term is identical to Zeus, so it makes perfect sense to the Romans to adopt Zeus as Jupiter. He's going to receive pigs as sacrificed by stone knives. We see this in their art. And he becomes the incarnation of power of the Roman state. Thus, the temple on the Capitoline Hill is where we get the word Capitol, dedicated to Zeus and the head of the Roman Empire, giving it power. Hera in the Greek tradition becomes Juno. She is the numina presiding over women and family. So it makes perfect sense that the goddess of marriage is going to be in charge of overseeing women and family. Demeter, or Ceres, in the Roman tradition, is related to the numina of wheat, that being the spirit that controls the growth of crops, whereas Artemis becomes Diana in the Roman tradition, and this is the numina of women and childbirth. Rather interesting because she's a virgin goddess. Hermes becomes Mercury, where we get our word merchandise or merchant. There is no Latin heritage as far as a numen for Mercury, so he's introduced under a new title that relates to what he does. He's the god of merchants and commercial activities, merx. So the Latin word merx gives us Mercury for merchandise. Hephaestus becomes Vulcan, because obviously they couldn't pronounce it, and also because, of course, this is Roman, but it is not a Latin. It comes through the Etruscan tradition as the god of volcanic and destructive fire, so they're adopting it from another people that they've conquered. Poseidon becomes Neptune, the numen of water, that being the spirit that controls water, which will become very important for the Romans' navy. But this is interesting because in the original numen, it was not responsible for the sea, but it becomes so once we align what Poseidon does with this god Neptune. Apollo, being transitioned and filtering through Etruria with the Etruscans, comes through unchanged. Apollo is still Apollo, the god of the sun and of aristocrats. Ares becomes Mars. Of course, this is a very obscure origin associated with wolves that once protected flocks. Or, in the Roman tradition, he could have been a primordial god of war. However, his name is given to the month of March, which is when military campaigns begin after the winter thaw. And so here we find that Mars is tied directly to war in his name. Dionysus or Bacchus is taken from the numen of wine. Makes perfect sense. Dionysus is the god of wine, so Bacchus is going to be the equivalent in charge of wine. Originally, interestingly enough, the numen was called liber or free. The female counterpart was libera. One becomes free when they drink, for instance. Athena becoming Minerva is actually an Etruscan import, so they're taking it from the colonies to the south. She was the numina of handicrafts. Pan represents the numen of unreasoned terror of the lonely forest, so of course it makes sense. They don't change his name. Aphrodite becomes Venus, associated with the numen of fresh water and vegetables, also of animal and human fertility. The protector of Aeneas, she is very important to the Romans. Thus we find that she's adopted from the Greek god characteristics. Hercules, or the renown of Hera, which is what her name means, takes on the Western pronunciation Hercules, who is the earliest foreign cult found in Rome. The same can be said of the Romanization of the following, right? Asclepius is going to be taken over from the Greeks. We find that Proserpina is Persephone, Ulysses is the Roman version of Odysseus, as we discussed, and Dispather or Orcus is the place Hades. Now, down in the Forum Boarium in Rome, we find an important temple to these imports from the Greek religion. Here we find the cattle market is where Hercules has numerous special cults associated with cattle, because of course he's asked to steal the cattle of the Gyrian. He kills Cacus for being a cattle thief outside of Rome, so he's an appropriate person to worship here. Supposedly, the Era Maxima, or the greatest altar, is dedicated to Hercules in thanks for killing Cacus to protect the cattle market in Rome. Rome's first Greek athletic contests were also held in the sanctuary to Hercules because he founded the Olympic Games, and these stories made their way to Rome. Roman generals also dedicated temples to Hercules and had portraits made of themselves dressed as him because everyone wants to be Hercules. Now, deities associated with the Roman family were retained, however. These were not changed by the advent of these Greek gods being brought into the pantheon. Lares are going to be protective spirits that are worshipped in shrines at crossroads where boundaries of four farms align. Every year, a doll is suspended for each family member of these farms. A ball of wool is going to be placed there for the slaves. Thus, they become a substitute for human sacrifice that would have been carried out in earlier periods. Penates are protected household things, especially you will have a pinnace, for instance, of a cupboard, or originally called a pantry, where we get the word. So things that protect those at home, such as protecting your food, protecting your family, protecting your property. The Dioscuri are associated with those who protect the Roman state. So remember, Castor and Pollux are going to be very important for the Romans as well, the great boxers who go on the Argo with the Argonauts led by Jason. Now, religious activity of the family relates to the gens, or the clan, in ancient Rome, and the familia, the household. Therefore, citizenship is equated to membership in a gens to confirm males. The head of a family, importantly, is called the paterfamilias, or the father of the family. They had the patria potestas, the power of the father, which was an absolute right, and this extended to everything. They could kill anyone who is going to transgress these rules of the family. That's how powerful they were. Once we are going to transition to a Roman Empire, the emperor is known as the paterfamilias. He has the absolute power and is head of the Roman state because Rome sees itself as one big family. So families worshipped the genius or begetter of a man, the spirit in other words, that passed on to his sons, not the person himself, which is often confused later on. Instead, the person is the object of adoration, but you're really thinking of their spirit if you want to understand it in modern terms. The distinction can be seen when worshiping the genius of a deified emperor and not the man. So at death, many emperors will be deified, becoming gods. And so these are going to be the spirit of the person that becomes a god, not the actual fleshy form of his body. The state, again, was seen as a large family, and Vesta, of course, the Greek Hestia, is also going to be represented as the flame of that family and the health of it. So 6 Vestal Virgins would be chosen at 7 years of age from patrician families. They would serve for 30 years, and after which they could marry, though few of them did because they had independence and wealth, and so they could keep their independence if they were single. Their responsibilities included tending the sacred flame of Aeneas, brought from Troy, and they took their duties relatively seriously, because if they were caught having sex, they would be buried alive in a tomb with a loaf of bread, water, and a lighted lamp, a slow way to die. The highest trait that one could have in Rome would be pietas, or devotion to the paterfamilias. And that's what Aeneas has, devotion to his father. So all Romans should act like Aeneas. This, of course, set up a rigid hierarchy and structure where the Roman state worked as long as the man in charge is going to have everyone's devotion and respect. They often became gods after their death, and so this kept the Roman Empire, a very large idea, possible. The Greeks, however, never regarded abstractions as divine. Everything they considered divine looked like a person, like Apollo, like Zeus, like Hera. So this is going to prohibit them, like the Romans, to transfer their notion of pious devotion from this idea of the head of a family to the Roman state. So the Greeks never evolved to become a nation state. In other words, the Greeks can't think abstractly like the Romans can because the Romans began with abstractions. So they can impose the notion of spirits, numen, numina on everything and are more flexible. So they can take their love of their father and then transfer that to the love of the emperor. Augustus, of course, is going to patronize most of Roman myth. So he's the one that pays for the creation of these mythological strategies. He uses them as propaganda for continuing of the old republican government, right? So this is a very interesting approach. Virgil, Livy, and Ovid are all going to be poets at this time that link present political situation to past mythical events and stories. And so everything that we've discussed so far in class is used by the Romans to explain why certain people should be in power, why the Romans should be in charge of everyone else, why they're such great warriors, etc. In Virgil's Aeneid especially, this is the epic myth telling the founding of Rome, written during Augustus's reign, is meant to glorify this founder of the Julian line and the first emperor, and explain that because of him we have a new golden age. Virgil's Aeneid chronicles the legend of Aeneas, the founder of Rome. Aeneas, if you'll remember, is the son of Anchises and Aphrodite, who's a cousin of Hector. Now, he hoped to succeed Priam one day, but was on bad terms for him. Now, Aeneas is an unusual hero because he has a divine mother, Venus, unlike every other hero who has a divine father. The only other example that we have would be Achilles, who has a divine mother. Poseidon, remember, is going to save Aeneas from Achilles in the Iliad, claiming that he will one day rule over the Trojans. The Romans had no native origin explanations of their own, so they borrowed an ancestor from another culture with a divine parent, thus making them descended from the gods. The story opens, as far as the Aeneid, foretelling the war between Carthage and Rome, their great enemy in the era following up to the empire. Places founding of the Carthaginians simultaneously to the burning of Troy. Thus, according to the story in the Aeneid, Juno, the queen of the gods, protects Carthage, this North African country, while Venus, the goddess of love and the father of Aeneas, protects Rome. We see this in several examples with Aeneas fleeing Rome. So this is the beginning of the story in which already we can see that the Carthaginians and the Romans are going to be enemies. Aeneas and his family, along with 12 shiploads of refugees, wander for 7 years around the Mediterranean, continually westward, closer and closer to the Italian peninsula. They begin, of course, at Troy, landing on Thrace, down to Crete, over to, once again, Croatia, over to the southern tip of the Italian peninsula, to Sicily, over to Carthage, and finally Lavinium near Rome. Carrying his lame father, who had been struck by a thunderbolt by Zeus, right, as punishment to Aphrodite, we find that Anchises is going to carry the household gods, the penates that we understand. And the son, Ascanius, is going to, through fire, become the image of Roman patriarchal family. You'll notice they're all male. So that is how the lineage is carried on in Roman civilization, is through the male line, much like the Greeks. So this is very reminiscent, if we think of the travels of Aeneas, to the Odyssey and Odysseus. First, they build ships and sails, stopping in Thrace just like Odysseus. So Virgil is very aware of what the Greek hero did, so he ensures that it sounds very familiar with this new Roman hero. Now, once they go to Thrace, they then travel to Delos, where Apollo's oracle says that they should seek the land of the founder of their race, Dardanus. They believe this to be Crete, but a plague besets them, and Aeneas learns that it is not Crete, but instead Italy. They stop on the island of Harpies, in which it is predicted that they will travel until hunger makes them eat their tables. So once again, long travels and suffering are ahead, much like, of course, that of Odysseus and his men. The story reminds us of Jason and the Argonauts, where, like the Harpies or snatchers, food is stolen from King Phineus, until Zetes and Calais are going to kill him, because they're the winged members of this entourage. Then the Trojans are going to travel to Epirus, where the Trojan prophet Helenus, the last son of Priam, describes to them the route to Italy and warns them to land on the western coast. Aeneas must found the city in a secluded valley by a stream, where he will find a white sow or pregnant pig with 30 piglets. They land on Sicily, where the enraged Polyphemus attacks them. Odysseus had just left, again tying the stories of Odysseus to the new founders of Rome. Thus they are creating this myth and this mythological founding that didn't exist before then. Aeneas' father dies here on Sicily and is buried. Then a storm pushes them to Carthage and Dido's palace in Carthage. Setting like Odysseus's in the palace of Alkienos, modeled on Homer, we find that Dido is going to fall in love with Aeneas and be a romantic counterpart. Venus sends Cupid to breathe passion into Dido, the queen of Carthage, for Aeneas. She swears to her husband's ghost that she would remain chaste, not marrying nor having sex with another man after he dies. Aeneas then tells Dido and her court of the fall of Troy and what has befallen them all. Here we see in several examples that Dido is receiving Aeneas, while Cupid is going to be pulling her to fall in love with him. So Aeneas and Dido, who of course is sworn to chastity, are out hunting one day when a thunderstorm breaks out. They take refuge in a cave and fall into each other's arms. Thus, of course, she is madly in love with him and asks him to stay. The neighboring king, rejected by Dido because of her so-called chastity, hears of this and prays to Jupiter, who sends Mercury. She said that she was going to remain chaste and would not marry. Aeneas is told by Mercury he must abandon Dido and leave Africa because of this transgression. This is the destiny of him to found the Roman race. So just like Mercury comes and tells Calypso to release Odysseus, it's still mirroring the story of the Odyssey. Dido hears of his leaving and then states, "Traitor, did you expect to conceal the crime you were planning and quietly sneak away from my land? Was our love unable to hold you?" So she is a woman scorned who is in love with someone who is leaving her, even though she broke her vow of chastity. She's enraged. She then threatens suicide. As Aeneas sails off, he sees the funeral pyre smoke as she curses him with her last breath. And this is the mythical explanation of the future Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage, the two superpowers in the Mediterranean at the time. The group stops again on Sicily for Anchises' funeral games, and the Trojan women here rebel, setting fire to the fleet. They want to stay in one place. They want to start a new life and not sail further. Aeneas leaves them behind along with the older, weaker men to start their own colony. And this is the explanation the Romans give as to why the Sicilians are inferior, because they are made of inferior stock and come from women who did not obey their men and from old men. So here, Palinurus drowns as Neptune demands for landing in the wrong place. In the Bay of Naples, we find Aeneas consults the Cumaean Sibyl, who plucks a golden bough and states that he must then enter the underworld. They then head to the river Acheron, or Sorrowful, the source of the river Styx, where they are ferried if they have fare for Charon. If they do not, you must wait a century to cross. On the banks he sees Palinurus, who is still unburied, as Odysseus encountered an unburied colleague of his own. Thus we're retracing the steps Odysseus made in the underworld. The Sibyl is then going to be the guide for Aeneas, and she drugs Cerberus, the three-headed dog, with a honey cake, allowing them to pass. Then they go through the mourning fields, those who died for love. There he spies Dido, similar to Odysseus and Ajax. She, of course, is going to be very sorrowful and angry and committed suicide because her love was spurned. They then move past Tartarus, but the Sibyl will not let Aeneas enter into this type of heaven, to the fields of Elysium in this sense. He attempts to embrace his father, and of course the ghost drinks from the river of forgetfulness, and so they're preparing to reincarnate and purify themselves of their crimes, but he cannot hold him. He's a ghost. Anchises is going to point out souls of Romulus, great generals of Rome, and the spirit of Augustus, showing that all of the most important people for Rome and its founding are in Elysium, in their version of heaven, thus of course establishing this hierarchy and why they should be in charge, the glory of Rome's past. They then head north and land on Latium. The Harpies' prophecy turns out to be harmless, as they find a local king, Latinus, who was told to marry his daughter Lavinia to a foreigner. So we find landing just south of Rome. This is when Aeneas is going to encounter them. War is going to erupt among the indigenous Italians, and coalitions of warriors, including Camilla, this warrior maiden, take part. The river god Tiber, remember there's personifications for every river in the world, convinces an alliance with King Evander of the Etruscans under Tarchon, where Aeneas finds the white sow and piglets, the place to found his city. Aeneas and Turnus, who wanted Lavinia, settle in single combat. So at this point, they both want to settle this area. And so this is reminiscent of Achilles and Hector, the two greatest warriors. Thus ends the Aeneid, as the Iliad ended with the burial of Hector, or the burial of Turnus in this example, because he lost. It is at this stage that we connect the Trojan War with the founding of the Roman Republic. Mars, like Venus, the progenitor of the Romans, is the father of Romulus and Remus. Venus is the mother of Aeneas, linked to peace, whereas Mars legitimized Rome's military conquest. So Mars and Venus figure prominently in Roman myth and stories. The field of Mars, in fact, is going to be the martial or military training area in Rome. But under Augustus, there were important institutions here, the Areopagus, the most important Roman ritual sacrifice, the pig-ram bullathon, as it's called. Mars presided over civil wars too, so it's appropriate since the Romans are going to spill their own blood when Romulus killed Remus. And so we find there is this altar dedicated to war and times of, once again, declaring war right in the middle of Rome. Now, here's where we need to fill the gap. Where we leave off is 1200 BCE with the Trojan War. That's when Aeneas lived. The founding of Rome doesn't happen until 753 BCE. So once again, we have a long time to fill in. So the story goes, Aeneas founds Lavinium after his wife that he married. His son Ascanius is going to found Alba Longa. Then a sequence of kings are going to rule for 12 generations until 450 years later, Romulus and Remus are born. According to Livy in Ab Orbe Condita, from the founding of the city, we find that King Proca had two sons, Numitor and Amulius. The younger drove Numitor into exile and killed all of his sons, and made Rhea Silvia, the daughter, a Vestal Virgin to ensure that she would not give birth to an heir. The Vestals, of course, then gave birth to twins that she named after Mars as the father. So this Vestal Virgin, or priestess, Rhea Silvia, she claims is raped by Mars, much like Medusa was by Poseidon, becoming pregnant. Because of this transgression of becoming pregnant while being a virgin, a Vestal Virgin, she is chained and thrown into a prison, much like Danae. Boys that were born of this illicit act, her twins, would be thrown into the stream and drowned. But the banks happened to overflow. This is divine intervention, and they were abandoned on a nearby mud bank. Their basket, much like Moses, for instance, or the ancient Akkadian king Sargon, floated down to the she-wolf who suckled them. The exposure of a child is much like Oedipus and Paris, if you remember, tying them to earlier traditions, who also were suckled by wild animals, such as a bear or by a goat. Moses also is going to be saved in a basket. So these stories all have already occurred in other cultures. The Romans are just looking for legitimacy for their own creation myth. The shepherd Faustulus is going to find them. So just like Oedipus, a shepherd finds him and brings him back to his wife. They are nicknamed his wife Lupa, or the she-wolf, and was considered to be a local whore. The royal brothers, like Amphion and Zethus, the Theban founders we discussed, will have a rivalry modeled on the sons of Oedipus when they grow up. So remember, twins either are going to be inseparable, like Castor and Pollux, or they're bitter enemies, like Romulus and Remus. The brothers grow up to be hunters of animals and then bandits. The loot that they received while robbing people, they divided with the shepherds. One day, the bandits captured Remus and handed him over to King Amulius, who gave to his hated brother, in turn plotting to kill the wicked Amulius. The throne thus was restored at this point, with the brothers as their true heirs, and Rhea Silvia their mother. The quarrel arose, and seniority could not be determined. Who should be king if they are twins? Who is older? They could not decide, so the city is divided between the Palatine and Aventine areas. This line you see here, right down the middle. And Remus is going to kill or be killed when he walks over his brother's half-built wall. Of course, then Romulus is said to have stated, "This is what will happen to anyone else who tries the same." Thus we find that one twin kills the other, becoming the sole king and heir to the Roman throne. The twins foretell the co-consuls and the dual role in the Roman Republic, or they're also added later to represent the plebes, for instance. The problem with this story historically is that Rome only really had runaway slaves, bandits, murderers, and pirates. And so we find, what must they do at this point? They need wives. According to Plutarch, the Roman historian, Romulus organizes a grand feast and invites the Sabines, their neighbors, to come and join. Then he gives the signal, and all of their women are abducted. They were promised that they would enjoy the privileges of married women, that their children would bind them closely to their new husbands, that they would learn to love them, come to love them over time. And this explains how the next generation of Romans were created. So in art, we find this as Roman soldiers, often dressed in Roman garb, are going to be gathering captive women. In the so-called traditional rape scenario, it means abduction. So the women are being abducted. And in the classical abduction pose, that means their hands are generally in the air. Now, Livy is going to expand on this, stating that the men spoke honeyed words, swearing passionate love prompted the offense. In other words, they were so in love with the women they could not help but take them as their wives. This is a tactic, Livy tells us, that touches a woman's heart. So they forget their resentment, a very interesting rationalization from a masculine perspective. 3 years later, the Sabines returned and attacked Rome in revenge to reclaim their women. The Sabines bribed Tarpeia, the daughter of the Roman commander, to let them in. She demanded what the Sabines wear on their left arm, a big gold bracelet. Therefore, she is going to betray her people. Once inside, they crushed her under their shields, also worn on their left arms. So she is going to receive just punishment for what she did in betraying her people. From that point on, the place is used for executions. Now, the women, interestingly enough, intervene according to the Romans, in which they already have children. So they throw themselves and their children, as seen here, in between the warring Romans and Sabine men, and says that women and children, especially children, are a reason to make peace, because now the two groups are related. Hercilia is the daughter of Tatius and the wife of Romulus, and so she often is featured prominently here, showing that she's the daughter of the leader of the Sabines and also the wife of the leader of the Romans. So she is the peacemaker in this instance. Romulus is going to die unexpectedly and rose into heaven, becoming a god. Afterwards, he would be worshipped as an ancient numen, and this would, of course, foretell what happens with Roman emperors who were deified after their death. Carinus, of course, is going to embody the military and economic strength of the people at the same time. This apotheosis happens with many emperors. There's an official place for imperial deification, and here you can see the visualization of it. They're being taken up to heaven by this psychopompos, this genius, or the form of an angel as we would understand it. This comes into the Christian tradition as angels lifting people up into heaven as they ascend unto seeing God or the Virgin Mary. Now, after an emperor died, the Senate, only the Senate, could then vote him a divus, a godlike entity, but not full power of an Olympian. So he does not become the same level as Jupiter or Mercury or Mars, for that instance. They worship the genius of the man, not the man himself, more like his spirit. So there was a cult of political power more than religious cults at this time relating to emperors. A triumph could then be declared, or a victory parade. Again, only a Senate could grant a triumph. Romulus was the first triumphator, for he had killed 5,000 men in battle, and his men proclaimed him triumphant on the field. Thus we find these triumphant arches will be erected as an honor to these great victories that they can walk through. This leads us to the Horatii and the Curatii and the war with Alba. In this particular war, in the old way, the Romans and the Albans decide to choose their two best warriors. In this instance, we find that the Romans choose the Horatii and the Albans choose the Curatii. Now we find that in the story, they take an oath to fight for Rome or die trying, as seen here, these three brothers. So we find that they go out and immediately two of the Romans are killed, while the last one, being outnumbered, comes back routed and won this great victory against the Albans. Now, returning, we find that he is cursed by his sister because, of course, that being what he had done is killed one of the relatives of the women living in the household. So the brother states, "Go to your lover, since you have forgotten your brothers, dead and living, and your country too. May every Roman woman die who laments an enemy." So he once again kills her. He is tried for murder, but then acquitted, because women need to place the state above the family, is the story, as we have been told. The end of the monarchy actually comes with the rise of the Republic in the story of Lucrezia. Now, army officers are comparing the beauty of their wives and the virtue of their wives to one another, bragging that they have the most beautiful, virtuous wife, but they cannot agree who is the winner. So they then sneak into the Roman city unannounced and don't tell their wives they're coming to see what they're actually doing. What are they up to? Most of the women are going about idle activities like drinking or gossiping, but Lucrezia, the wife of Tarquin Calatius, is going to be very virtuously spinning wool. She's a good wife. Later, Sextus Tarquin is going to be very attracted to her, seeing she's a good woman. So he sneaks into her house while the husband is away, drew a sword, and demands sexual favors from her. She refuses, so he threatens to kill her and a slave. And if she does not, he will tell the husband he found both of them in bed together, joining once again shame and death. So therefore she gives in to his sexual advances. Thereafter, she then is going to represent an exemplar of chastity, because after being raped, she stabs herself. And then in order to safeguard her husband's honor, she is now, once again, not pure. So the family's honor is not intact. So she kills herself because of it and wrings her father. So we find that the father and the husband come and she explains what happens. So once again, we see here that the entire incident unfolds. In revenge, we find that the Romans are going to go against the Tarquins and overthrow those leading the monarchy at the time, giving birth to Rome as we know it, overthrowing foreign rulers. So summoning family friends, including Brutus and the cousin Tarquins, she stabbed herself to defend his honor. Brutus drew the dagger out of her chest and summoned people and called for expulsion of the tyrant and his brood. The new order established would be the Senate. The first two consuls, Brutus, a relative, of course, of the later Brutus everyone knows from the play Julius Caesar, and Tarquin Calatius, the husband of Lucrezia. So we find this supposedly coincides with the democracy in Athens in 510 BCE. So we can align what's happening in Rome with what's happening in ancient Greece. The death of Lucrezia is often retold as a so-called sexy suicide, where we see this woman, partially clothed, has taken her life. Not really in the original tradition. It's not meant to be something that is sensual. So next class, since we just talked about the foundation myth of Rome and how they co-opted many Greek ideas, we'll talk about how to interpret all of what we've been discussing over the course of this term with the interpretation of myth.